This is a video that I've been waiting to do for so long. To celebrate Death Battle officially coming back and surpassing their Kickstarter goal by 8 times, I'm going to be ranking every episode of Death Battle's best and most recent season, Season 10, from worst to best. Giving my thoughts on each episode's analysis, fight, research if I care enough, my connection to the matchup, my history with each episode, along with my thoughts during and after the waiting period, and how I felt about the community's response too. But most importantly, I'll be discussing how much justice each episode does in representing its matchup as a death battle. I'm also going to score every episode of percentage from 0 all the way up to 100. If you want to know how that translates into basic out of 10 ratings, then here you go. Along with my favorite and least favorite episode, I'm also going to be pointing out the most overrated, underrated, disappointing, and surprising episode of the season, on top of my favorite and least favorite scene from each episode. Also, I'm not as deep into the hive mind that is the Death Battle community, so expect to see a few hot takes here and there. I don't have anything else to say, so let's just start already.
The Bird.
Okay, what is his name?
The Bird.
His name's Bird?
The Bird.
The Bird.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the Bird.
Raven vs. Phoenix seems to be the universal choice for worst episode of the season, and I hate to be a sheep, but I definitely agree. Even with how little investment I have in Killua vs. Misaka, for instance, it still had more going on than this episode. The analysis was fine, but easily the weakest one that we got all season, even as someone who loves Marvel and DC and still enjoys seeing them appear on the show. When I first watched this episode on July 30th, 2023, I actually remember really enjoying both rundowns, but my most recent rewatch, they were just okay to me. I don't think it's the intense bore fest that Raven's old Season 5 episode was, and it was cool seeing the character's omniversal scaling, which Raven vs. Twilight didn't pay any attention to at all for Raven, but I still had a very passive experience watching through this analysis. There were also some pretty weird moments in the editing, like the JPEG of White Hot Phoenix, and the end clip that they added at the end of Raven's analysis, that felt like they forgot end clips weren't a thing anymore until production was starting to wrap up, yet they just kept it in, but without the audio, I guess. And along with the kind of mediocre editing, the royalty-free music choices also made it harder to get into this analysis, as they were surprisingly really dull. For two of the most powerful characters in all of Death Battle, the background music has about as much energy and grandness as something that you would hear playing in a library. The editing in general felt like a major step down from Ant-Man vs. the Atom. Surprisingly, the only thing that impressed me all that much in this analysis was the jokes, which were all really good. I especially loved when they stopped Jean's analysis to point out that she died 4 days before the episode even came out for Champions. They didn't have to do that, but I'm so glad they did. Now as for the fight, I had pretty much the same experience as what Nemesis Bloodreich described in his solo review. Initially, I was so blown away by how stunning the visuals were for everything that I ignored how dull the actual content of the fight was. But now that the recency bias has worn off, I don't think this fight really gets above just decent. It honestly peaked at the preview way more than Megatron vs. Frieza if you ask me. The fight felt like it was on track to match Black Adam vs. Apocalypse in terms of cape shit fights, and it had the exact kind of speed and intensity that I was hoping the fight would at the very least start with. Unfortunately, it fell off big time after Raven's Genjutsu, which had a similar problem to the rest of the fight's choreography. The choreography felt very similar to Sasuke vs. Hiei, in the sense that things just kinda happen as if they're on a checklist, and there isn't too much creativity or cleverness to anything, and the connective tissue is almost non-existent. The Genjutsu scene just kinda happens out of nowhere, and then immediately ends without the cool payoff of Kakashi's all the way back in Season 7. The scene of them trying to mind control each other looks really goofy and dumb for a fight that should feel intense and hard. And the fight just kind of devolves into mindless colors, as the two just stand around and show off like Scarlet Witch and Zatanna in that episode. The transformations also feel like they're on a checklist of mandated things, and take up basically the entire choreography, with no breathing room or build up at all. Thankfully the action improves in space, and we get an amazing shot of the Phoenix Force looming over the entire moon. I haven't talked about them much since they don't exactly carry the entire episode into being amazing, but the visuals for this fight were absolutely outstanding, and some of the best in any Sprite fight. To quote DJ, the Soul Self of this episode makes the Raven Twilight one look like MS Paint. The Soul Self and the Phoenix Force look so clean, high quality, and the colors of everything in the fight in general pop so much. But getting back into how flawed the actual content of the fight is, the planetary destruction felt the most fake out of any episode in the series, and it isn't even close. Even Vegeta's moon punch from season 1 had more impact than this strange shot of Raven chucking a moon at all the Phoenix clones. The plants feel more like bowling balls, and it takes a lot away from what should be a really awesome sequence. We get a really weird use of slow-mo, and the fight goes back to that same checklist choreography, as we get more transformations in the white hot room, which feel like they're there out of obligation rather than because they had any unique or interesting ideas for them. At least the death looks really awesome. The final energy clash is stunning, with all those colorful circles around it, and the shot of Raven blowing out what remains of the Phoenix Force was an incredible shot as well. The conclusion also did a good job explaining the outcome, and they actually did Raven justice instead of saying she can power all of Manhattan for 3 years, and that her durability scales with someone surviving moon-busting attacks. Overall, this episode doesn't do much for me aside from the visuals and a few cool sequences towards the very beginning, middle, and end. The analysis is decent but nothing special, and the fight lacked any interesting progression since things just kinda happen as if they're on a checklist without the exciting choreography and creative writing that the vast majority of episodes this season had, or even the exhilaration and sheer stimulation of an episode like Vegito vs. Gogeta, as this fight on the other hand was fairly low energy in comparison. As great as the visuals were in this episode, we've gotten plenty of other sprite fights like Silver vs. Trunks and Jonathan vs. Tanjiro that looked about as good and had infinitely better content on top of that. My favorite scene would have to be the first clash that the Phoenix Force and the Soul Self got into, which is kinda sad since it means the fight literally peaked at the sneak peek. And then my least favorite scene is what comes immediately after the sneak peek, as we get this really stupid looking and lame shot of the two trying to win their mental struggle. I know putting this episode in last place is one of the most basic takes you could ever have about this season, but if you want a really hot take from me, Thanos vs. Darkseid is still the best Marvel vs. DC Reality Warper fight, and it isn't even close in my opinion.
58%.
For Raven vs. Phoenix, not for Thanos vs. Darkseid, that episode is criminally underrated. Despite how relatively critical I was of this episode, I just want to point out how impressive it is that the worst episode of Season 10 was still one that I kinda liked in the end. Never has that happened before in the history of Death Battle, as Seasons 1 through 4 have at least one episode that I hate, Seasons 5 through 6 had their fair share of mediocrity, Season 7 went back to the not-so-good, good old days, and Seasons 8 through 9 had a few pretty terrible episodes that were salvaged by one thing about them completely carrying.
Oh no, there's no police here to help me. I hope you don't find the money strapped to my thigh.
Killua vs. Misaka is pretty much the equivalent of Roshi vs. Jiraiya for Season 10. They're both relatively niche anime matchups that were initially pretty forgotten compared to the other episodes around them and the fan-favorite seasons that they released in, but after their seasons ended, everyone hyped them up as being hidden masterpieces that were easily the highlight of their respective seasons. But similarly to how I feel Roshi vs. Jiraiya was really overhyped, I don't really get what's so special about this episode either. I might be biased because, rather than being bored to tears by Marvel and DC like the rest of the community, I don't really care about anime as a genre, aside from Dragon Ball and maybe JoJo, and I feel like Death Battle absolutely has an overabundance of anime characters, so I thought this was one of the most average episodes of the season by far. Although I would probably sound more positive if this episode didn't release in Death Battle's most stacked lineup to date. So I still enjoy this episode for what it is, even if what it is doesn't appeal to my interests in any way, really. The analysis is pretty good. Definitely one of the better analysis segments for an anime matchup that I don't care about, since they actually got me way more invested here than I was in Asta or even Tanjiro's analysis. The Kilowatt-ton running gag was painfully unfunny, however, and as much as I still like this analysis, I can't say I'm really in love with it either. The fight was also good, and the choreography had a lot more to it than Raven vs. Phoenix, since there's actually some level of strategy to what the two did, and it wasn't just a generic recreation of abilities that they brought up in the analysis with no originality. To be honest, I actually don't have any major problems with what happened in the fight, and what both characters did. It starts kinda slow, but still solid. I like the skateboard chase across the rooftops that falls, and I like the idea of the fight on the side of the building. The ending also has some really cool stuff, but I'll get into that later. If you're wondering why it took me only about 3 sentences to give a Cliff Note summary of everything memorable that happened in the fight, this is the shortest animation of the season by far, as it does not even crack 3 minutes. I definitely felt this somewhat, as not a ton happened in the fight that was all that epic. And unfortunately has the complete opposite problem of Raven vs. Phoenix, since the sprite rigging in this episode was honestly pretty bad at points. And stuff like the previously mentioned fight on the side of the building, which I would have otherwise loved, was ruined by how stiff the posing and movement was. It generally perplexes me when people rank this episode above so many other better ones this season and try hyping it up as better than Galactus vs. Unicron, when it has the worst puppet rigging in the show since Rock Lee vs. Sanji. I hate to blatantly plagiarize Biff Wheat's white bread analogy, especially for an episode that he idolizes this much, but yeah. Luckily, it's only one character who has this problem, even though she has it the worst of any character from the past 3 seasons. Killua's custom sprite looked really good. I didn't have any problems with it in the animation as far as I could tell. The kaiju at the end was also amazing, and I not only love the shot of Killua leaping over it, but I also love the shot of him in the air with the giant snake. The death is fine too, I guess. My favorite scene is obviously the kaiju, and my least favorite was when Boomstick brought the Killua-ton joke back in Misaka's analysis. In the conclusion, since it's just a pretty lame running gag. Overall, this episode is technically good aside from the kind of bad sprite rigging for Misaka, but it's not that captivating for me personally, since it's just another high school anime death battle with nothing special to set apart from the others. The analysis, fight, and conclusion were all good, and realistically probably deserve around a solid 7, putting my general disinterest aside. In fact, I even gave this episode a 7 when it came out, as I was pleasantly surprised that I managed to get more out of it than other anime matchups that bored me to tears, like Deku vs. Asta. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I don't really have it in me to go back and rewatch this episode regularly, and I simply just struggle to care enough to rate Killua vs. Misaka higher than a 65%. Sorry guys, but it's not really for me, in the same way that Ant-Man vs. the Atom isn't exactly something that speaks to Biff Wheat on a personal level.
This is ABC I Like Pie.
Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer is probably the most divisive episode of the season. Half the community thinks it's a subversive and brilliant masterpiece, while the other half thought it was boring and pretentious. Personally, I fall in the middle, because I thought this episode had a lot of great stuff, but as a whole, I don't think it's as sublime as some people say it is, and it's easily what I would call the most disappointing episode of the season. After none of this season's sprite fights really held a candle to what we got in the previous 2 seasons, I was really banking on Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer to finally be the first amazing sprite battle of the season, toppling over all competition to at least get above Ant-Man vs. the Atom and Rocket vs. Stitch. Instead, it was just more of the same and even more tame than the other sprite fights we got. The analysis was thankfully not disappointing in the slightest, as I was really invested all the way through. The visual gags and editing were great and a huge step up from Raven vs. Phoenix, as we actually got some animation in the comic books. The analysis itself was also a lot more in-depth than usual, which I appreciate. It did tread fairly similar ground to Raven vs. Phoenix by bringing up Superman breaking Infinity, but hearing about how Martian Manhunter stood up to the god of DC Comics was really cool. And like I previously mentioned, I love the visual gags like the Roblox avatar and the Martian Manhunter Funko Pop. All that stuff definitely gave the analysis more personality, and the coverage of Martian Manhunter's story was also super effective. Silver Surfer was good too, but I don't remember as much about his analysis. So if anything, this analysis exceeded my expectations and made me really hopeful that the fight would continue this great streak of quality, giving us our new best sprite fight of the first half. To give it credit, it starts and ends really strongly, as I love the Twilight Zone vibe of the setup. We also get some hints as to what the plot of the animation is, as Martian Manhunter is attempting to figure out why Silver Surfer has summoned him, and chases him down to try and get the answer. The Polaroid photos of other Marvel vs. DC death battles, as well as the hidden Billcord cameo in the background, were a fantastic touch. So allow me to give my theory on the backstory behind them and Martian Manhunter's involvement in the death battle timeline prior. It seems as if Martian Manhunter has observed the phenomena of other death battles from over the years, and has been trying to put the pieces together as to why these heroes who no one would ever expect to fight have been killing each other so many times in the course of only 3-minute fights with often petty reasons, all well before Silver Surfer finally summoned him to engage in one himself. The Atom's grotesque ant death, as well as Scarlet Witch and Zatanna facing each other as the scene's reference, makes sense, as Atom and Zatanna are 2 characters that Manhunter is affiliated with. Bill and Discord's cameos on the drawing board could also hint that he observed their forms appearing near so many other death battles, including yet another that involved a DC hero, and also this very episode, along with the cameos of Space Hawaii and the Macho Man vs. Kool-Aid Man Constellation. The model of Bill that he has is even the exact one that was in the background of Guts vs. Dimitri. It's also a lot more worn down than it was in Guts vs. Dimitri, which is a great detail since Berserk and Fire Emblem take place way in the past, and Manhunter likely found it hundreds of years after Guts died standing up. As disappointing as I found other elements of this animation that I'll get into later, I absolutely adore stuff like this, as it not only makes the fight feel like an official crossover between Martian Manhunter and Silver Surfer, but it also makes it seem like these past seasons in the modern era all take place in the same universe and have actual world building to them. Seeing how these characters interact and respond to previous death battles and the situations that all these universes being crossed over creates appeals to me so much, as all the subtle but really cool details in the setup go a long way when it comes to making the stories that Death Battle tells feel that much more lived in and real. That can be said for 4 other much better episodes that I'll get into a lot later. Getting into what happens after the really cool title card that really gave the fight a great 1960s vibe, I wish the entire fight had a more grainy comic book look to it. But I'm glad the whole thing wasn't black and white, as that would have been going way too far in my opinion. But along with the animation switching to the visual style of every other Marvel vs. DC fight ever made, the actual content of the animation becomes boring and pretty much non-existent when it comes to the actual fighting. I know the really hardcore defenders of this episode would probably use the excuse for how boring the fight was, for how Silver Surfer wanted to escape Martian Manhunter's interrogation due to not knowing the answer himself, as well as the fact that the characters are pacifists and their goals didn't really involve killing each other in this specific context. But at that point, why even bother doing the fucking matchup if you're not going to have them get into a satisfying fight? The whole point of Death Battle is not just to see characters from other franchises cross over and interact, but more specifically how a fight between them would play out, and the cool ways in which their power sets could bounce off each other to give us a fight that's creative and exciting. Not giving us a proper fight just for the sake of some kind of commentary on Death Battle is borderline pretentious in my opinion. I know the character moments of Death Battle are what people have been praising them for the most lately, but I still go to this show to see characters fight more than anything else, and this episode didn't really give me that aside from one moment that I'll talk about later. As much as I still love the story in this episode, I can definitely say that it was taken way too far here. When I saw the sneak peek on the Death Battle cast, I was a little concerned due to how slow and uneventful the fight was starting, but I was still holding out hope that it would pick up similarly to how other episodes I had the same worry for did. Then my dreams were crushed when we got to the end card, as it stayed that way for almost the whole fight. Without sugarcoating anything, I can't fucking stand the chase sequence in this episode since it's just so repetitive and their few attempts to spice it up by giving us different POVs were ultimately fruitless, since the choreography has absolutely no variety to it whatsoever. It's just the same thing over and over, and it's not even remotely stimulating at all. I was genuinely bored out of my mind during this part of the fight, as I wouldn't even say they did the bare minimum when it came to giving us a capeshit fight. Despite how much praise this episode gets for being creative and unique, it felt like they refused to come up with anything cool or interesting for them to do power-wise, and they just resorted to making Flash vs. Quicksilver 2.0 instead for some reason. Thankfully, this game of cops and robbers had to end somewhere, and although I don't really care for the bit with the clones, everything from Martian Manhunter using his forehead laser to him being thrown to the sun was actually what I wanted to see. The highlight of this part of the fight has gotta be Martian Manhunter's dragon transformation. Manhunter breaking Silver Surfer's board was already a cool moment, but then him seemingly turning into his true form only for it to be revealed as the dragon that they briefly brought up in the analysis was an absolutely amazing moment. And the hand-drawn animation done by Moro, aka Droop the Hedgehog if you remember him from Cartoon Fight Club's early days, looked beautiful. Then the dragon lands its first attack that Silver Surfer dodges, and it slices up an entire moon in the background, which actually felt impactful unlike anything in Phoenix vs. Raven. We get to see more of this absolute unit in action until Surfer freezes him with an absolutely clean looking hand-drawn ice effect, and throws him into the sun with some flawless sprite rigging. That entire sequence was amazing. If the whole fight gave us more of the two using their powers in unpredictable, badass ways, rather than just chasing each other around like a bunch of school children, then it would have been an amazing episode. Now we get to the ending, and it went really hard in terms of character and emotion. It didn't quite get the same response out of me that it did for everyone else, but I still thought it was a great way to end the fight, as it revealed that Silver Surfer did not know the answer of why Martian Manhunter was summoned either, and it gave us a very unique take on Death Battle, as for once, the characters actually tried questioning why they were made to fight, and as I stated earlier, Martian Manhunter had even been investigating this far longer than when Silver Surfer showed up. The answer itself being unknown fits perfectly with the nature of Death Battle and the inevitability of characters who would realistically be friends killing each other in the end. Silver Surfer wishing for Martian Manhunter to make peace with the fact that neither of them succeeded in getting the answers, and his statement that he still senses worth in their battle as Manhunter accepts his death to be with his family again was also the perfect way to end this fight story, along with the ending shot of Surfer silently mourning Manhunter's death. As a whole though, the fight felt very over-reliant on gimmicks. While the gimmick of this episode was great with the meta commentary it makes on Death Battle as a concept, as well as the cool discussion it creates and the theories that arise from the hidden details throughout the fight, I don't think these aspects made this entire episode a masterpiece due to the fact that 50 seconds of the animation was made up of stuff that I found completely lame. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I can ignore the fact that I found nearly a third of this fight animation was about as generic and dull as it gets. The thing is, I know for a fact that the writers and animators for Death Battle can do better than this. That's because they have for so many other episodes. A lot of my favorite episodes of this season and the entire show in general have a balance of giving us the character interactions and story moments that make it feel like a genuine crossover of both fighters and their series, along with giving us great and exciting action that uses the characters' arsenals and abilities to create as many memorable moments of spectacle as possible. So I don't understand why they just completely gave up on this matchup and had the entire fight dynamic be the two fleeing from each other and only properly engaging in combat a single time. They didn't even get into a fist fight utilizing Martian Manhunter's stretching and phasing as well as Silver Surfer's teleportation and surfboard, let alone one at all. Manhunter only shapeshifts once, Surfer doesn't turn his board into anything, and there was hardly any molecule or elemental manipulation. I know I'm doing the thing that I get annoyed at Nemesis Bloodreich whenever he does, but at least episodes like Sonic vs. The Flash or even Batman vs. Iron Man still had really cool action and memorable moments. This is all especially frustrating when it ruins an episode that I could have otherwise given a 9 or even a 10 out of 10. This is absolutely among the episodes with the most wasted potential for me, as it genuinely had the makings for one of my favorite Sprite episodes in the series. I mean, look at how great the fight was when they actually did try to come up with cool things. Say whatever you want about these episodes on screen, but at least they gave us consistently exciting and fun fights that were still satisfying, even though they weren't flawless like a lot of episodes this season that actually lived up to their full potential. I'm not expecting every episode of the show to be a 10 out of 10, and neither should you, but I at least want a good fight that's entertaining. These 4 episodes absolutely delivered on that, which is why I think they deserve way more credit instead of just being given the label of wasted potential, as if anything less than a 10 out of 10 is automatically mid. Well, this one really didn't give me a fight that I could be content with. The fight choreography is the most important part of Death Battle for me, and not only does this episode have the worst choreography of the season, but it was outright bad for most of the animation, and I got nothing out of it. They barely even fought throughout the whole animation, almost all of it was just the two running away like pussies. The entire fight was as boring and creatively bankrupt as the chase scene, and the episode had a Batman vs. Black Panther tier analysis along with its honestly kinda weak conclusion that doesn't explain the power cosmic, and is only right by the show's own logic due to a very brief mention of galactic scaling. And it would have been a 4 out of 10 since I got a generally below average Morrow vs. DC flying brick fight. Thankfully, the great analysis set up climax to one really cool moment of action, the world building for the Death Battle universe, and the overall story that the animation tells elevates this episode to a flat 70% for me. Make no mistake, however, the fact that these elements were able to take an otherwise bad fight that I kinda disliked and made it good in the end speaks high volume for how amazing they are. My least favorite individual scene would have to be Martian Manhunter flying away from Silver Surfer because it just completely kills any potential this fight could have had after Surfer's attempt to escape failed in the sneak peek. Well, my favorite scene is definitely the climax since it was a great payoff for this animation's greatest strength, that being the story. Next segment please, I'm in genuine disbelief at how long this review ended up being, and it's not even as long as my review for what's at the #1 spot.
Oh my god! Oh my god! Are you kidding me?
It didn't take long to get into the really controversial rankings, because Rocket Raccoon vs. Stitch is easily what I would give the title of most overrated episode in Season 10. Not because it was disappointing like Surfer vs. Manhunter, but more so because the characters don't appeal to me quite as much as Poe, SpongeBob, the Doctor, or others from Death Battle's more character and comedy focused fights. I didn't even really grow up with Lilo and Stitch either, so I'm not exactly the most perfect target audience for this episode, even if I can still get behind it just fine, unlike Sasuke vs. Hiei or Killua vs. Misaka. But for what Rocket vs. Stitch was, I actually think they knocked it out of the park and gave me everything I wanted, even if more laid-back death battles like this are not usually all-time favorites for me. The analysis was solid and had some good jokes, which is essential for this matchup. The Boomstick's ex-wife cutaway gag especially is one of, if not the funniest cutaway gag in the whole show. Rocket's analysis was good too, but I prefer Stitch's. The fight all throughout is simple and fun, but none of it really had me on the edge of my seat, and the fight did feel really short. But thankfully its biggest strength comes in the comedy and capturing the spirit of both characters in absurd ways. Like the part in the opening gunfight where Stitch's gibberish gets translated into him saying something about Rocket's mother. The comedic timing there was great, and said gunfight was really enjoyable. Even if Stitch's melee towards the end and the animation rewind coded throw he does on Rocket does not look very good. But luckily the rest of the movements involved in these two custom sprites look great. What follows is another funny and expressive scene of Stitch just getting absolutely blasted to hell by Rocket, and then getting sent completely flying. Then immediately after, we get the funniest scene in the whole episode, where Stitch calls Rocket a space N-word, causing Rocket to be so offended that he summons his infinite dimensional Thanos Buster in response. The following bit is fine, but not as fun as the rest of the animation. Also doesn't feel like they put much attention to having the choreography match what they said about the character's fight dynamic and the conclusion. Instead of having Stitch being too fast for the laser to fully hit him and getting briefly grazed by it, which knocks him back and severely damages his body, they have him tank it head on, surviving and overpowering it with brute force. Thankfully, I like the moment where he builds his own ship out of the destroyed Milano to get around Rocket, and the death that follows is really good. The very end of the fight also captured the spirit of Stitch in the edgiest way possible, and it was a very artful touch, I must say. Overall, I don't really have a ton to dissect about this fight since there weren't many moments that blew me away necessarily, but it's still a pretty great time overall that doesn't have anything major holding it back. If anything, this episode reminds me a lot of Wario vs. King Dedede and even Mario vs. Sonic 2. It's a funny episode that I always enjoy watching, but still a fairly light experience overall. I wouldn't really say anything about it was a 10 out of 10. The track Jailhouse Rocket also did a great job in aiding this fight's chill and laid-back vibe. Now as for the research, I feel like they wanked the characters, but that's more of a side effect of Death Battle's rules and them having a different philosophy when it comes to power scaling than I do, as versus debating is very subjective. I believe more in direct feats and less in shaky, inconsistent scaling chains that don't really match a character's demonstrated limits. But at least Death Battle defined their rules of featuring characters at their best, and have properly stuck to them in the past 3 seasons, so I can't really complain. And I'm glad I got this tangent out of the way as soon as possible in my Death Battle season rankings. And if me respectfully disagreeing with Death Battle scaling methods makes you upset somehow, I'll take them wanking characters and scaling them to things they probably shouldn't over them downplaying every character on the show like they did for the first 5 seasons any day of the week. Even if I'm not the kind of person who could ever buy stuff like Batman being building level with just his fists, every single one of Ben 10's aliens scaling to an out of context and off-screen feat from Armadillo that's supposedly large planet level, or Stitch being universal with one random statement alone, along with the animation doing the complete opposite of what they said would lead to Rocket's demise, the conclusion still makes a lot of sense by the episode's logic, and it's interesting seeing a Death Battle fight where the loser is infinitely stronger, but still gets stomped. As it is, Rocket vs. Stitch is definitely one of the most reluctant 8 out of 10s I've ever given, and to give an exact score, I'd rate it a 76%, which is about what I was expecting to give it when it was announced. My favorite scene was Rocket pulling out his strongest gun in response to Stitch calling him a space retard, and my least favorite was this really awful looking throw on Rocket towards the star that generally looks worse than anything in even Killua vs. Misaka.
How many nanometers long is your penis? 1 million.
Ant-Man vs. the Atom is easily the best Marvel vs. DC premiere we've ever gotten, but it still couldn't escape the bottom 5 this season, which was entirely made up of episodes in the first half. To put it into perspective how much the first half completely pales in comparison to the second half in Season 10, this episode would be where the upper half of my ranking for it would start. And although it's not nearly as high anymore, I still love Ant-Man vs. the Atom. The analysis was genuinely amazing, and easily one of, if not the best Marvel vs. DC analysis in the show. It did an incredible job at covering both characters in an interesting and fun way, bringing up a lot of crazy stuff for the Atom, like how he created kryptonite from Superman's body, and tackling Hank's story perfectly, especially towards the end. On top of that, the editing was great and made the analysis even more memorable for me. I even really liked the pizza running gag with Boomstick. Overall, this analysis worked for me on pretty much every level, and is easily the highlight of the whole episode along with something else that I'll get to later. The fight isn't quite as strong for me, but it's still really good. Similarly to Rocket vs. Stitch, it's not exactly giving me an adrenaline rush, but it's still fun. The setup isn't great, but if anything, Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer made me like it more. Then they start fighting, and I liked how they used the environment around the desk, but I wish we got a lot more usage of the environment around the lab, since most of the action is just basic punching and kicking with not much to it. I did enjoy the shot of the metal balls where it cuts to them only being tiny in the real world. And what I enjoyed even more than that was how they actually used the size manipulation for the hand-to-hand combat in a really creative and well-choreographed scene, along with the really cool bit where Adam massacres a bunch of ants with his sword. The environment when they're microscopic looks really nice and colorful, and the action's neat too. Then we get to the Microverse, and instead of just throwing this in here because it was something important mentioned in the analysis and not doing anything with it like the white hot cum dimension, we get some good hand-to-hand fighting, once again utilizing the size manipulation, followed by a pseudo kaiju brawl since the Atom can't grow past the size of a normal human as it turns out. Having the fist fight while growing out of the Microverse was a great compromise, and Hank's line before he takes him to the Overspace was one of the coolest lines of the season. When we do get to the Overspace when the kill happens, and long before this episode came out, whenever I pictured what the death for Ant-Man vs. the Atom would look like, I always pictured Ant-Man shrinking into the Atom's anus and then exploding him from the inside of the most abrupt and predictable kill of all time. Instead, we got the most brutal and insane death of the season as the Atom has ants coming out through all over his body until he explodes into an atom symbol made of ants. The cut back to the Eternity during the Ant Massacre felt a little abrupt, but I'll still take this any day over the Thanos meme. The conclusion, along with the analysis putting Ant-Man at Outerversal and the Atom at Multiversal, was also really eye-opening for me, as someone who thought they were only city block level. Overall, this is one of the few episodes in the series where the analysis mostly carries it, and that realization has made me like the episode a little less compared to when it was first uploaded. The fight isn't the most blood-pumpingly intense thing I've ever seen, and on its own it probably would have gotten a mid to high 7, since like pretty much every sprite fight this season, minus 2 of them, it felt fairly simplistic. But I still rewatched this entire episode a lot more than most people. Even though I definitely feel like I've seen it too many times, I still haven't gotten nearly as tired with it as I had with other episodes that I was high on recency bias for and weirdly obsessed with. I'm giving it a 77%. My favorite scene was the death because of course it is, and my least favorite scene would probably be when the ant says, "Yath, Queen," since it was kinda cringy, not gonna lie. As low as this episode may seem, it doesn't really have any major flaws. I know it may seem like I hate sprite animation based on what I've had at dead last on this list, but maybe the next segment will change your mind. Megatron vs. Frieza is easily the weakest 3D fight of the season for me, and it seems like the vast majority of people agree. Even then, I think it completely blows the previous episodes on the list out of the water, despite having the second worst waiting period of the whole season for me. As someone who had Megatron vs. Vilgax as one of his most wanted matchups and didn't at all care for Frieza vs. Megatron as a matchup, I was pretty disappointed when it got revealed as the next time after Cole vs. Alex, and that Death Battle decided to go with the normie pick for Megatron instead of giving the main villain of one of my favorite shows growing up a banger matchups in terms of connections, vibe, and fight dynamic. Please don't do this for FNAF, I'm begging you. Despite that, I was still really excited to see both characters on Death Battle, and I still had high hopes that they could make an awesome fight. But then it ended up being the first episode of the season in which Death Battle took away early access for champions. I even bought a Rooster Teeth membership impulsively since they've never said anything about it being taken away from there too. So not only did I have to wait an extra day to watch it, but I also spent $10 to watch this episode for literally no reason. All of that combined with the fact that Nemesis Bloodwreck was skipping it and that the sneak peek was making me worried the fight would be another Lex vs. Doom since a whole minute had passed and they hadn't even properly started fighting yet. All this made me ready for this episode to be the first one of the season that I'd call outright mid. But then it finally came out, and we got a way better episode than I ever thought this overrated matchup would give us. As for my stance on the champion membership situation in retrospect, I'm actually glad they got rid of it since it resulted in the last 6 episodes being way more successful than not just any of the previous episodes in the season, but also any episodes since season 7 or 6 after looking at the statistics relative to how long each episode has been out. If anything, I wish they did this a lot sooner so that many of the other matchups this season could have done better, especially the champion matchups. Although I still see no justification for why they got rid of early access for Rooster Teeth members, as it doesn't affect the YouTube algorithm and they just have been releasing them early on Rooster Teeth for many years prior. Putting all the drama of the waiting period aside, let's talk about the actual episode. The analysis isn't one of my favorites, especially because of my burnout on anime matchups, also extending to Dragon Ball Super, obviously because of how much they've been spamming it lately, but I still thought it was really good. Frieza being based on real estate speculators was something brand new to Death Battle's Dragon Ball rundowns that I never knew. And Megatron's analysis especially was pretty great and fares a lot better than the last two Transformers rundowns we got, as I learned plenty of cool stuff about him. Megatron becoming an Autobot surprised the hell out of me, that's for sure. The fight is mostly fantastic, but it has one major problem that I'll get to later, and it's not what you're thinking. Along with the visuals and cinematography being amazing, the setup is really good, but nowhere near where the episode peaked if you asked me, as the actual fighting for the first 2/3 was all great. Frieza's first line after the preview felt like it disrupted the pacing a little, and I wish we got the full panic bubble fight that was featured in the storyboards, but Megatron punching Frieza into the edge of the bubble, causing him to ricochet into Cybertron, was a great moment. The fight gets truly amazing once they do land on Cybertron, and we get some really awesome and fast-paced combat with Megatron's mace, which is, in my opinion, one of the coolest weapons ever featured on Death Battle, aided by some super dynamic tracking shots of the two fighting in close quarters. Frieza exploding Megatron along with all of Cybertron was amazing, along with Megatron blasting Frieza away in his tank form. I know the Golden Frieza transformation gets a lot of hate, but I actually liked how long it was, as it made it feel even more grand and impactful. What follows after is a godlike shot of Golden Frieza summoning the giant purple Death Ball, and it is undeniably one of the greatest shots in Death Battle history, along with the shot of Megatron staring it down in his tank form. Megatron turning around and launching himself into the air with his own tank blast like Soldier from TF2 and then charging right into the Death Ball while maniacally laughing was insanely badass, along with Frieza telekinetically pulling Cybertron closer to trigger the explosion. I think the storyboards had a better visual of this scene, as they showed Megatron actually being pushed into standing on Cybertron while continuing to defend against the Death Ball. And I think that would have made the scene better, but I still adore what we got. After what was one of the coolest sequences all season, we get to my biggest problem with the episode, and that's the climax. I know Megatron's monologue is a scene that everyone creams themselves over in this episode, but honestly felt like it kind of ruined the climax. Like I said when talking about Martian Manhunter vs. Silver Surfer, the action will always be the most important part of the show, regardless of how good Death Battle's character interactions are. And despite there being a few a few exceptions to this, Megatron vs. Frieza is not one of them. Megatron's monologue was still really cool, and I love the visuals of the antimatter, but I'm not as madly in love with the scene as everyone else is, and I don't really think it pulled an Omni-Man vs. Homelander and made me glad we didn't get more fighting. I wanted to see Black Frieza and Antimatter Megatron have an amazing final battle to close the animation off on a high note like so many other 3D fights have done with their final forms, but instead we get the two staying around talking with no energy or excitement whatsoever. Thankfully the kill itself makes up for this. I don't know if it's because of Megatron's loud standing up noises making the illusion that the music was getting quieter, but I swear I heard the music winding down after Megatron attacked Frieza with the antimatter despite the disagreements of some. So I honestly thought that Megatron won when I first watched, and I was shocked when Frieza was still revealed to be alive. The longer runtime of the animation definitely helped keep me on my toes wondering who's going to win at every moment, because I was constantly thinking, shouldn't this have ended already? The killing blow destroying all of Cybertron was amazing, and the last shot of Frieza goes unbelievably hard along with his promise to kill every single Cybertronian. And you know what, if this is a Cartoon Fight Club episode, I bet the rematch would be a final face-off between Frieza and all the Transformers characters for 20,000 likes. Overall, I only have one other minor problem with this fight, and it's the one that everyone brings up. I felt like almost every shot in this fight went on for ever so slightly too long. It doesn't feel nearly as distracting as Gamera taking Godzilla into space for half the animation, everything to do with the stomach dimension in Kirby vs. Boo, or even the black hole scene in the Mega Man Battle Royale to give 3 hot takes for the price of 1. I definitely found it to be a way more subtle issue, but I did notice that a lot of the scenes in this fight went on for maybe a couple seconds too long, with Frieza cracking his neck especially feeling really unnecessary. At the same time, however, I also felt like the longer establishing shots and more room to breathe compared to other modern animations made this fight feel a lot more dramatic and impactful than the average quick cut Death Battle fight. Unlike Hulk vs. Broly, which didn't really linger on any of the destruction, Megatron vs. Frieza does, and it really makes the planetary destruction feel more impactful than almost any other Death Battle episode that's attempted the same thing. I don't mean to be such a contrarian, but I really don't get why people ridicule this episode for being too slow, while they praise the 3 episodes that I mentioned previously for being peak Death Battle. Especially since they've criticized a lot of episodes of Death Battle before for being too fast and not having enough room to breathe. Well, I feel like this episode fixes that exact problem. Call me recency biased all you want, but I think the extended runtime and slightly slower pace felt way more appropriate here, since it was just some shots going on for a little longer than I would have liked, rather than entire massive scenes that completely derail the fight. And the actual close quarters combat was animated really fast, unlike Wario vs. Deity, which is another episode that I felt like was too slow, but I guess no one else agrees with me. As someone else... Who the fuck is someone else? As someone who has had this problem with a lot of Death Battle fights feeling too slow and low energy ever since I started watching the show back in late 2016 and binge watched everything in early 2017, I only felt it ever so slightly here, unlike everyone else who criticized this episode way more than any of the actual Death Battle fights that I felt like were too slow. I genuinely feel like I've been watching different versions of these episodes than everyone else, honestly. And, well, to get back into the rest of the episode, I also feel like it was kind of a cop-out to bring up the Japanese G1 comics in the quarter box, only to not even use it at all in the episode while still compositing the American comics of the cartoon. Despite having such an underwhelming climax, I still thought this episode was phenomenal and managed to give us an amazing fight for such a generic matchup in my opinion. I have heard from some Transformers fans such as Nemesis Bloodreich that it didn't really do a good job of covering Transformers fight since it was more of a Dragon Ball fight. And although I can absolutely relate to that criticism as someone who's had to deal with the most popular matchup for one of his favorite franchises being this, but I'm not really a Transformers fan, so I thought it was really cool. In fact, I haven't even brought up the best thing about the entire episode. That's Final Formers, which is probably my 3rd favorite Death Battle track of all time. Easily having one of the most intense feelings of any track in the series, and surprisingly even blowing away Wings of Iron. It definitely brought this episode up to at least an 85%. My favorite scene in the fight has gotta be the shot of Golden Frieza summoning the Death Ball, since it's one of the coolest looking shots in any Death Battle fight ever. While my least favorite scene is the brief moment where Frieza stops to crack his neck, since it was the one time where I really thought the pace of the fight was killed.
Could you please hurry up? I need to go to the bathroom, too. Come on, hurry up, toilet man. I haven't got all day, you know.
Gojo vs. Makima was better than I ever could have expected it to be, and I've only liked it more and more as time has gone on. I wasn't excited for this episode at all for the same reasons why I was not really interested in Killua vs. Misaka, but I kinda needed a matchup that I was not really invested in at that point, since Marvel's Spider-Man 2 was coming out that week, along with other stuff that I needed to take care of at the time. I wanted to put my free time into other things aside from Death Battle. Then I actually watched Gojo vs. Makima and it surprised the hell out of me, immediately dethroning Ant-Man vs. the Atom as my 2nd favorite Sprite episode of the season. I was adamant before that it was still the weakest episode of the second half, but after my most recent rewatch, I definitely prefer it to Megatron vs. Frieza. It's got a much better analysis and less flaws in the animation, even if it's not as epic. Speaking of the analysis, it's incredible. Not only was the editing great, but I was hooked the whole way through despite not knowing either character at all really. Gojo's did a great job at covering his insane powers that are unlike any other character in the show, and Makima's did a great job covering the insane world of Chainsaw Man, which is unlike any other franchise in the show. The uniqueness of these two franchises definitely made this analysis and this episode in general stand out a lot more compared to the average weeaboo matchup for Death Battle. I also love how before the fight starts we get an explanation as to what the circumstances of the fight will be, as that absolutely adds to the uniqueness factor of this episode along with the intro and outro title cards for me. The fight itself is fantastic and devoid of any major problems to my knowledge. It definitely felt like it was on the same level of craziness and awesomeness as the last 2 seasons' Sprite fights. The setup is easily one of the best they've ever done. I not only love Jack vs. Afro being the movie that they were watching, but I also love the ghosts of this season's 3D Death Battle losers appearing in the background. As for what actually happens when they start fighting, I don't have a ton to say about it, since as Emerald Grove pointed out in his ranking, most of the choreography mainly boils down to Makima throwing a bunch of stuff at Gojo and then him just kind of ignoring it. But I still thought everything they did in the fight was really cool, from Gojo's cursed energy to the demons that Makima summons. They even worked in Makima's ability to transfer any damage dealt to her towards a rammed Japanese citizen by having King Ass Ripper over here die from a Violet First laxative prank. The sprites, effects, and hand-drawn shots all look amazing, and the fight is full of great character moments and voice acting. My favorite scene would have to be the domain expansion at the end, which is incredible in every single way and one of the most visually stunning things in any sprite fight. There's also a lot of cameos that ensue when Makima gains infinite knowledge, further showing that every death battle is connected, and that Makima also found out the truth about death battle, which not even Martian Manhunter or Silver Surfer could do. My least favorite is pretty hard to choose, since this is easily one of the most consistently great episodes that Death Battle has ever made. But Gojo's "You're so weak" line was not nearly as good as others in my opinion. Getting back to why this is such a great episode, the conclusion was one of the most engaging they've ever done, and it was really interesting hearing how the totally unique power sets of these two bounced off each other. Overall, this is the kind of Death Battle episode that I want to see more of, as the analysis, fight, and conclusion all complement each other perfectly to make an episode that I love every second of, where each component is equally as good. After many episodes in the previous seasons either had a boring analysis, a lame fight, or a poorly lit conclusion weighing them down, I'm proud to say that Season 10 is the greatest balance of all these aspects of any season, with only one and maybe a few slight exceptions if I was really stretching for it. Not one part of Gojo vs. Makima had to do the heavy lifting, and for that I have to give it an 87%.
Alduin was going to eat infinity. Multiple infinities.
I refuse to call this episode Dark Souls vs. Skyrim, since it's not an animation rewind total war between Team Skyrim and Team Dark Souls, and it's just a 1v1 between the Chosen Undead and the Last Dragonborn. But Chosen Undead vs. Dragonborn is still an episode that I never would have expected to place this low. Towards the beginning of the season in June, I was expecting this episode to be very difficult to top. I only thought about 2 or maybe 3 episodes could, like the champion matchups or the finale if it just wasn't one of the champion matchups. Instead, this amazing episode has been topped a total of 8 times after it was released, and didn't even make the top half. As for the episode itself, I was so excited for it when it was announced way before the season started, and it definitely lived up to the hype even if it wasn't nearly as good as Liam's 2 other babies. Starting off, it's got a phenomenal pair of analysis segments. The Chosen Undead's analysis did feel like a weaker version of the Dragonborns for most of it. I might be a bit biased in saying that since I don't really care about Dark Souls at all, while Skyrim has always been a universe that I've been interested in ever since I downloaded the NPC pack for Gary's Mod back in 2014. However, when Jocelyn shows up in the Dark Souls analysis, the tone drastically changes and it really ends on a note so great that it might even surpass anything in the Skyrim analysis. The Dragonborns is an S-tier death battle analysis all throughout, as it covers the insane world of Skyrim in a really entertaining and funny way with memorable moments all throughout, like the return of Macho Man Randy Savage as a dragon, and the cheese calc. It almost makes me want to play the game myself. The fight is also amazing, but it has some problems, like how janky the Dragonborn's model can look with his hunchback neck and soy jack mouth expressions, not to mention his deformed arms at points, how awkward and stiff the Chosen Undead's hammer attack is, and how it has probably my second or first least favorite ending of the season. Along with the very end, the start of the fight isn't that amazing aside from some excellent shot composition at points, but the sword and shield combat gets better and better as it goes along. Starting off a little bit stiff but still good, then getting a lot faster and more impactful, and then ending off phenomenally well. Throughout the rest of the fight after the sneak peek, there's tons of great abilities on display, along with some amazing visuals and cinematography. Pretty much everything from the dragon being summoned to before the first flame is summoned one last time is 10 out of 10 death battle stuff. Not only is the dragon awesome and the lightning clash really great too, but both are immediately overshadowed by the masterful shot of the 2 knocked back by the blast, which has easily got to be one of the top 5 best looking shots in any death battle episode, bare minimum. The build up to the final clash after they got blasted away by the lightning in general goes harder than the vast majority of death battle episodes do at any point in their runtimes, and genuinely tops the actual sword clash thanks to Fireborn being one of the greatest tracks that death battle has ever done. You see that animation rewind? This is how you get your fans involved in the production of your Versus episode in a way that not only does not drag the episode down, but also enhances it in the best way possible. But who am I kidding? Rewind doesn't see anything. He can't even see that half the videos on his fucking channel have been trimmed down to a few seconds. What I hope we all can see, on the other hand, is how amazing and well animated the final clash of their strongest swords is, along with the last shot of the Chosen Undead impaled through the chest before the kill. Unfortunately, the very end of the fight didn't do much for me, despite how amazing it looks, as not only have I found it really confusing for the longest time, but it felt really anticlimactic seeing the first flame get stomped by such a basic shout. The conclusion is also absolutely nuts, as I never could have imagined how powerful these characters were gonna get, and how crazy the cosmology for Skyrim is. Overall, this episode felt like it would have been a way more exciting premiere than Ant-Man vs. the Atom. Despite a few problems holding it back from staying in the top half, I still adore this episode for having two great analysis segments, along with a super cinematic and epic fight. With my favorite scene being the build-up to the final clash, since it is easily one of the most hype-inducing moments in all of Death Battle, and it contains some amazing cinematography. But my least favorite would have to be the Chosen Undead's hammer swing, since it looks pretty bad. As much as I don't care for the death, at least it looks visually stimulating, unlike this wimpy hammer swing. Aside from that, I can guarantee that this episode would rank in the top 4 of any other amazing season, like 5 or 6. I'm giving this episode a 92%.